Live from Djerber, this is the Locktoon Podcast. I'm Amy.
And I'm Mel.
Today we're covering the short story The Unwanted Guest by Tamsyn Muir. Yeah, we're finally here. This story can be found in the appendices of the paperback edition of Nona the Ninth. It takes place immediately after chapter 23 of Nona the Ninth in the book, so we're taking a little break from the novel to cover this very cool and exciting extra. This kind of goes without saying, but if you haven't read The Unwanted Guest yet, please go read it before listening to this because we will absolutely spoil it in every way.
Yeah, as a reminder, you're listening to a reread podcast, which means that we basically reread the chapters and the short stories on our podcast. So go read the original text. And of course, as always, if you want to support artists in the Locktoon fan community, you can check out our Locktoon Creator Hub at locktoonpod.com/fanmerch. And if you want to support Amy and I here at the pod, you can find stickers, pins, magnets on our website. You can also just donate to us. I'm still delayed. Shocker. But it's your merch will come. Your merch will come. Amy, before we dive into it.
Yes.
What is the literary term for a story that has an ending with a twist?
Is this a joke or is this trivia?
This is a joke.
Okay. With a story with an ending, I don't know.
A nefarious turn. I think approps for today's journey that we're about to go on.
All right, that was a pretty good one. Did you come up with that this morning when we both texted each other and said that we both had yet to prepare for this?
No, I came up with it about 3 minutes ago. So,
oh my God. I could still see your cursor moving across the screen as you made notes 3 minutes ago. Oh, man. All right. Nefarious turn. So let's just lay some groundwork here in true Tamsyn Muir style. This short story is written in a completely different way than any of her other Locktoon writing before this. It is written as a play. And we already know that Tamsyn Muir has an interest in and knowledge of theater and playwriting because of, numerous references in previous books. Remember when she kind of set up Harrow the Ninth using some of the structure of a Greek play?
Yeah.
So her writing this play should not have been particularly surprising to me. However, I was very surprised when I started to read it. I was like, wait, what? And then I was like, oh, of course, it's Tamsyn Muir.
Yep.
She would choose the one thing that she hasn't done yet.
Totally. And I can't say that I was thrilled by this. We knew a short story was coming. I also was surprised it was a play. Some of my worst high school English experiences had to do with reading and annotating plays. Some people love that. That was not for me. So when this came out, I was like, oh man, my kid was 4 months old at the time. I wasn't sleeping. I had very little ability to actually read well. But I did read it.
Nice.
And I did love it by the end. And now on my 5th read through, I'm like, oh, this is good. And not only is this good, but the revelations in this narrative have such major implications for the entire series. Not to mention, we get a little Dulcinea spice thrown in.
Yep.
That raises some big questions about her and the river.
Yep.
But I won't get ahead of myself. But I will set the stage for us, if you will. So as Amy mentioned, the story takes place at the same time as Camilla and Ianthe are dueling. And Palamedes' soul has presumably jumped into Nefarious' body when Camilla touches Ianthe during their fight sequence. We just reread the duel between Ianthe and Camilla in our last episode, so now we get to dive into this other kind of duel here between Palamedes and Ianthe. And it is ultimately Palamedes' goal to take over Nefarious' body and kick Ianthe out. So that's what we're working towards here. And we've also seen interactions in this soul space, bubble space before. What with Harrow's bubble, with the Canaan House crew, and in Palamedes' bubble with the romance novel in Harrow the Ninth. So this type of setting is somewhat familiar to us. And I will just add that back in Harrow, when Harrow's bubble is starting to crumble and she kind of comes into awareness of what's happening and is having this conversation with Abigail Pent. Pent even says to Harrow, "This isn't a picture you're drawing, Harrow. It's a play you're directing. You set up the stage in the river, you pulled in ghosts as your actors, and you enforce certain rules to keep your cast on script. But now another director is trying to hijack the play, and the struggle for control backstage is leaking over into the action out front. You're being ousted." And so Pent was using metaphor here to describe what was going on.
Right.
And I just think it's so cool that we actually, like, the metaphor becomes more literal in the form of the story that Tamsyn is writing here. Like, she is literally writing a play.
That's actually, I didn't really connect those two things, but that is really cool. Yeah, that totally makes sense. And I feel like now that line by Abigail was kind of foreshadowing this exact story. Yeah,
Totally.
that makes sense.
Yeah. So let's untangle this psychological web. Get into it.
Yes. So the play is called The Unwanted Guest. It has 6 scenes. So scene 1 opens up. It's a very short scene where Palamedes seems to be encountering Ianthe at her own funeral. So the scene setting is that there are these gaudily masked mourners that are parading past a coffin that is covered in fake flowers. There are like 6 other coffins behind this decorated coffin, and these mourners are picking up meat that's in front of the coffin and then walking by the coffin and leaning into it and either kissing whatever's in the coffin or like feeding it. Hard to say. And then the last mourner is Palamedes, and his mask, unlike these sort of gaudy other masks of the other mourners, his mask is a broken wooden mask that looks like it's been taped and glued together, which I think is a pretty obvious reference to the skull that Camilla taped together from his dead body. And Palamedes passes the coffin. He does not take the meat and reaches in, and Ianthe sits up in the coffin and tells Palamedes, "You're fucked, my lad." And that's the first scene. And my question with the scene, besides just sort of setting the stage for the rest of the play, is this the first time? It seems like in this play, it's kind of the last go round of many, many, many go rounds that Ianthe and Palamedes have had. So is this the first time that Pal kind of goes head to head with Ianthe, or is this just like one of many, many times that Pal has gone head to head with her?
It's so hard to say because I feel like even in Harrow's river bubble, it was unclear. Like, everyone seemed to be dropped into a moment, and it was unclear if it existed before we got there or not. And I kind of feel the same ambiguity here, where I'm just like not totally sure. As we move into the next scene, there's a description of Palamedes' suit being completely ruined. I guess these large holes were ripped in the fabric. A jacket sleeve is hanging off at the elbow. One of the leg trousers is charred and blackened as if by fire. And so that could suggest that he and Ianthe have been literally like in a fight, you know? It could also be representative of Camilla fighting Ianthe and its impact on Palamedes' soul. And that is then personified here. So I don't know. I don't really know the answer to that question. I feel like it could go either way.
Yeah. Well, regardless, scene 1 is a separate instance. So it is before the rest of this play takes place. But then we get to scene 2, where Ianthe presents the game that will dictate the rest of this story. So the scene opens up on the same room, but the coffins are gone. And then Ianthe is, for some reason, dressed as a butler, and Pal enters, like Mel said, wearing sort of a mangled suit. He seems fine, though. So, like, his body seems fine, but his clothing is wrecked. I think of it, like you said, it's sort of like his body, representing his soul, is okay, but the thing that it's living in, the clothes, Camilla's body, is wrecked. So, like, his soul's okay, but what he's clothed in is breaking down. And Pal asks Ianthe Butler to see the lady of the house and says that he's all the gentlemen who have called earlier. So he's been here many times. So he's been coming here, presumably having some sort of face-off with Ianthe, and then leaving and then coming back multiple times.
Right.
And we have to keep in mind that he feels like he's been doing this for like a week, but only seconds are passing in the real world.
Totally. And then Pal gives Ianthe, the butler, his calling card, which is a skeletal hand. And the butler says, if you'd be so good as to wait here. And then Pal does give very Palamedes things and starts to discuss the nuances of language use around the word if as a tool for false courtesy. And the whole thing, we're not going to go through this line by line, but I find the whole thing really funny. I remember when I first read this in my throes of sleep deprivation, I was like, what is happening here? Like, I couldn't follow it at all. And I was like, what am I reading?
Yeah.
It's really clever and it's really funny. And he's basically saying in so many words that Ianthe's an asshole and that she's like pretty much in charge here. She's going to do whatever she wants, regardless of what any of his responses are to this. So he goes through this whole like analysis. And while he's doing this, Ianthe, dressed as a sexy maid, so hilarious, comes in at some point. She's fake cleaning the fireplace, I think. Mm-hmm. And Pal asks her if she agrees with him, and she says no. And I don't know the point of this, if the point of this is just to annoy her.
I feel like it is to annoy her. The only way he's going to get to see her is if he bothers her so much that she's just like, okay, fine. And there's nothing that bothers her more than him debating or getting all technical.
Right.
Like a true sixth house nerd.
Right.
And it works.
Yes, it does work. The butler returns and says the master of the house will see Palamedes in the almond room. Which, like, does the almond room have any significance? I couldn't find anything, but...
Yeah, I think this whole story, you can get so easily caught up in little details like this. Like, what is the almond room? Like, why is Palamedes talking about the uses of if in common courtesy statements? Like, I think you can get so easily caught up in this stuff. But at the end of the day, there's some things that you can discover from these little asides. But generally, this is all mostly fluff and like ambiance and feel. Like it gives you the feel of it all.
Right. Totally. So these cloaked figures bring coffins in. They're marked 1 through 7. And Ianthe enters and sits on her chaise lounge. She says that Palamedes is extremely late, 5 minutes to midnight, I'd say. You can't last much longer, and we both know it.
Mm-hmm.
I thought this was like referencing her duel with Camilla. Camilla's going to lose this duel. You're like out of time. But it could also be just related to Palamedes continuing to fail at his encounters as well.
Yeah, I know she says later that she's pierced Camilla's spleen. And I think she's, just referring to the fact that Camilla is going to die. And at that point, Pal will have no house.
Right.
Yeah.
And so Pal says he's there for the body of Nibiri's turn. This is something that we know.
Mm-hmm.
And Ianthe's just so bored and tired of beating him up that they're going to play this game. And the game is that Nibiris' body is in one of 7 coffins, and Palamedes has 5 questions to figure out which coffin the body is in. They cannot be questions about the coffins or where Nibiris' turn is. And Pal, of course, asks Ianthe if she's going to play fair, and she says, I never do. 4 questions left.
Yeah, and it's funny because obviously this is an annoying, like that wasn't meant to be one of his questions, but Ianthe takes it as one of his questions. But then it bothered me because he asks like a million other questions, but Ianthe doesn't take them. But I guess she's only going to do this stupid thing where she takes a question that's not like one of the main questions as a question when she wants to. Like she's being manipulative. But there was part of me that every time Palamedes asks a question, I was like, that's your 7th question. That's your 20th question.
Yeah. I had the same feeling. That actually really bothered me. And I feel like there's no way Tamsyn Muir didn't think about that. So yeah, I don't know. I feel like it could be that Ianthe was really sucked into the conversation with Pal. So
yes,
kind of distracted by the content of the conversation to begin with. So he could get away with those lines of inquiry. Uh-huh. But it still definitely bugged me.
Yeah. And then the way that these scenes usually work is that Palamedes and Ianthe have an exchange and then the curtain falls And then Palamedes is left alone with the audience, with the curtain behind him, and he speaks to this voice sort of like out in the crowd. And so this time, Palamedes speaks to the voice, and he says he's confused by the game, but the voice says that he's thinking of it too much as a logic game, and he should be thinking of it as a psychology game.
Mm-hmm.
And just because it's good to have the context, we later learn that this voice is Dulcinea, the real Dulcinea. It's so cursed that you have to say the real Dulcinea with this book.
Yeah.
But yes,
Totally.
the real OG Dulcinea. Yeah, and then we move into scene 3.
Right. I'll just add that it's Dulcinea who really helps Palamedes figure out what his line of inquiry is going to be here.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, while Dulcinea both does remind Pal that like this needs to be a psychological game, and she says try to get her, Ianthe, to expose herself enough that you can see the answer for yourself, which is what Palamedes ends up doing. But they really are a team here, and it almost does feel like without Dulcinea, Palamedes might not have actually won this game.
Right. So we get to scene 3, which is Pal's first real question. So curtains up, Pal enters the room, and now there's a robed figure beside each of the coffins. And Pal's first question is whether Ianthe believes in the permeability of the soul. And then we get to this point, which I think threw a lot of people off through this whole short story, this whole mini play. The figures that are standing next to the coffins pick up some of the coffins and move them around so that they're rearranged. And these coffins now have little plaques on them that say 1 through 7. And this seems like it should be very significant. I couldn't find out any significance, but I will not lie that the first and maybe even the second time I read this, I really got caught up on this, even though, I mean, personally, in the end, I think it's Ianthe playing a game with Pal where she's trying to, like, Palamedes would also try and pull this apart, and Ianthe knows that. And so she's moving these around so that he thinks it means something. That's what I thought it was.
Totally. I mean, I spent my first sleep-deprived read-through trying to figure this out, which is so funny. And as you can probably imagine, I failed to figure out the significance of the orders of the number. Like, oh, they changed in this way, and then they changed in this way.
Yes.
And I have also spent a really embarrassing amount of time trying to read through different people's takes on the numbers, and I have concluded that nobody can figure it out. And like, this fandom can figure shit out. So if the entire fandom has not figured out the significance of the numbers, then the math ain't mathin', and I think it's more of a red herring, and that Tamsyn did this on purpose. I feel like this is like Tamsyn's joke on the fandom to be like, I know my fandom. I know that they are really extra, so I'm going to throw them this puzzle that they're not going to be able to figure out because it's not a real puzzle.
Almost as if the entire fandom is Palamedes and Tamsyn Muir is Ianthe.
Totally.
It's like, let's see if we can distract them.
Yep.
But needless to say, Ianthe is very annoyed by Palamedes' question, which is exactly the kind of question she hates. She thinks it's very boring. And she says that he should have asked her something sexual, like a never have I ever type question. I mean, of course. And she also offers him a drink and he refuses because the wine isn't real there. I wasn't sure if that had any significance, but that is what happened.
I think it's just a comment on this like weird in-between soul bubble space and how like what is reality and what's not here. From what I can remember from Palamedes and Harrow's conversation about these bubbles is that you can't actually bring like real objects into them.
Right.
And so everything that's not a soul is actually not real. It is a projection.
Right.
So this is just an example of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is a good amount of back and forth between Palamedes and Ianthe about whether soul is permeable. You know, they throw around words like malleable and elastic and all of these things. But the bottom line is that Ianthe believes that a soul is indivisible and impermeable, but it is malleable. And what does that mean, Amy?
Well, basically, I think Palamedes is trying to push, I think he knows what she believes, but he's trying to push her in several different ways to admit that there could be a chance that the soul could be diminished or changed permanently. And Ianthe just doesn't buy it. You know, her big argument for why it's not diminishable is that it being permanent is the underpinning of the theory of lictorhood, because the lictors have their power from this soul that never diminishes. And if it diminishes, there would be a diminishment in their powers, obviously. But Palamedes' point is that they don't know because it just hasn't been long enough. It could be slowly diminishing. Like Augustine the First, 100,000 years in the future, might have a diminishment of powers because it does kind of degrade over time. And they just can't prove that because there's never been a lictor around that has been that old. And Ianthe's kind of like, okay, I mean, I guess maybe come to me when you're a lictor and we can talk about this. But my experience as a lictor shows that you are not able to diminish a soul.
Right. I would lift up one other important tidbit from this scene that comes back later is around the elasticity of a soul. And so Palamedes says, and Ianthe agrees, that a soul is not elastic, meaning that once it's altered, it can't go back to its original shape. That's kind of like thinking about how you as a person interact with things all day, every day. Like you have an experience and it changes you. Right. You're never not going to have that experience. That happened to you. And so that changes you as a person.
Right.
I think Olivia Butler in Parable of the Sower says, whatever you change changes you, whatever, you know? So it's like that kind of idea. But this idea that the soul can change based on its interaction with external forces is something that we come back to a few questions down the line.
Yeah. Ianthe is tired of this question. She says she knows more about it than Pal and tells the attendants to clear the floor. The curtain falls again, and Pal is once more conversing with this mysterious voice in the audience. And the voice says that Pal is using the wrong strategy and that basically that Ianthe is showing Pal what he wants to see. So she's letting him pull her into lengthy debates like this so that he feels like he's getting the upper hand. And the voice says that Pal should stop asking Pal questions and start asking Ianthe questions.
Right. I think she says, you're underestimating Ianthe.
Right.
And I really like this. She says all that, oh no, how boring stuff is huge lies, and you ought to know it. If Ianthe hated books and loved parties, she wouldn't be the only necromancer in nearly 10,000 years to ascend successfully to lictorhood. I just feel like Dulcinea read Ianthe, you know?
Oh, yeah. Better than almost anyone else has.
Totally. Ianthe's not stupid, and she puts on this act, but that was like the whole thing through the first book is that no one paid any attention to Ianthe, but Ianthe is the one that actually did what they were brought there to do in a really horrible way. But she's smart. And so Ianthe is playing Pal right now. And Dulcinea is like, buck up, dude.
Yeah.
You know, like you need to get creative in what you're doing or this isn't going to go anywhere.
Yeah, I really like, I mean, knowing that this is Dulcinea, their dynamic is, I just think, so great. She's harder on Palamedes than anyone else. And we as readers, I think Palamedes is just the smartest thing that's ever existed and kind of take anything he's doing as gold. Like he's going to do the smartest thing every single time.
Right.
But Dulcinea is actually just as smart and sees his weaknesses and encourages him to move away from them. So I think that's very cool.
It is cool.
And I think this is the first place that there's a hint that it might be Dulcinea as well.
Yeah, I think towards the end of scene 3, when Dulcinea and Palamedes are wrapping up their conversation, Dulcinea says, I believe in you. And Palamedes says, you didn't always. I had to fight for that. And I think that at this point is maybe when I had an inkling that this could be Dulcinea. I think I probably thought, is this a version of Cam somehow?
Yeah.
But that wouldn't have made sense because Cam has always believed in Palamedes. It makes sense that this would be Dulcinea and not Cam.
Yeah, I don't think on my first read I knew it was Dulcinea yet. I think it was later. I'll try and remember as we continue on. So we get to scene 4, which is question number 3. So Pal walks back into the room. The coffins have been rearranged again. Palamedes' third question is, do you regret the murder of Nibirius Turn? And there's an interesting moment where the hooded figures hit their coffin once, like bang their coffin once, and then they're rearranged again.
Yes. And then Ianthe's like, murder? Is that what we're calling it now? And Palamedes is like, yeah, it is. There was malice aforethought.
Mm-hmm.
And at this point, Ianthe's like, no, I wouldn't say there was any malice involved. I have a very loving, generous nature. And Palamedes slams both his hands down flat on the lid of the coffin and then thrusts his arm out and points an accusing finger at Ianthe and says, you're avoiding the question. And it seems like both of them are surprised by this reaction.
Yeah.
And I think the assumption here is that this is actually Nibirius's influence on Palamedes.
Right.
And I also saw a theory that some of these hooded figures, some of their reactions also might be influenced by Nibirius's soul as well.
Right. It makes sense that this whole bubble is being influenced by Nibirius, because at the end, that's the whole point of this short story, is that Nibirius, but the soul is permeable, and Nibirius is here the whole time.
Right.
So Ianthe starts to answer the question in a roundabout way. She says that it's a cavalier's job to die for their necromancer, and Pal retorts that it's the cavalier's job to protect their necromancer. And Ianthe basically makes the point that because Ianthe is her ambitions, like all that there is to her is her ambitions, it was right for Nibirius to die to protect Ianthe's ambitions. So, an interesting argument.
Right. I mean, Palamedes and Ianthe couldn't be more different in how they think about and care for people in their lives.
Right. There's an interesting moment where Pal points out that Ianthe never stops to check the price tag and just pays the full price up front and walks away. And I think this is, again, I mean, Pal's figured out perfect lictorhood, right? Where the two souls are exchanged simultaneously, creating a lictorhood where no one has to die. And he's just saying that, like, instead of trying to figure out a better way, Ianthe just figured out this way and just assumed that that was the only way, and paid the whole price without even thinking about it.
Right. And I think one of the tactics here that Palamedes is using, which doesn't work because it's Ianthe, but he's trying to point out that she knew Babs her entire life. They had this relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, she talks about how he really was loyal to Corona and not her anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that he was like born and bred for this role. There's a couple different things throughout this conversation around, it reminds me of some of the ways that we've heard the different houses talk about the role of the Cavalier and the Necromancer in the past.
Right.
Like the 8th house selects Cavaliers for their genetic compatibility. And Palamedes, I think, actually points this out in their conversation. But the 3rd doesn't. So he was surprised to learn that Babs had actually been part of a branch of Ianthe's family's like royal line. And so they're not necessarily even cousins, but they're not distantly related. And so it wasn't like he was chosen because of all of his skills or traits that made him a good cavalier. He was literally born into the role. And he worked really hard to be a good, quote unquote, good cavalier.
Right. It's an interesting revelation that the 3rd seems to select their cavalier purely based on pedigree. And Ianthe says that if he hadn't been the perfect cavalier, they would have made him a perfect cavalier. Like, it didn't matter the vessel. They were going to pound it into shape regardless. So, I mean, just a crazy way to look at this. And I think Palamedes this whole time is just hung up on the fact that as he's learning more about their relationship, he's realizing that these are two people who knew each other from the cradle And yet Ianthe seems to view Nibirius only as a resource.
Right. And so this seemingly has no impact on Ianthe. I don't think that Palamedes can bring her around to share his moral point of view. And so when Ianthe exits the stage,
after saying no,
right,
her answer is ultimately no. She doesn't regret it, which is wild.
Right. Yes, that is the answer to the question. Palamedes is horrified and again has another conversation with Dulcinea about how he's nothing more than a resource.
Mm-hmm.
And that, of course, if, she views this person as a resource, of course she's going to use this resource.
Right. And as he's saying this, in a very weird aside, he takes a packet of cigarettes out of his pocket and expertly lights one and smokes it. And Dulcinea, or this mysterious voice, who we don't yet know is Dulcinea, says that, she didn't think he smoked. And he kind of looks down at the cigarette and is very confused and seems, for at least a couple of lines, like he's very distracted by the realization that he just did something that, he doesn't habitually do at all.
Right. And so Dulcinea asks Palamedes, do you have an idea for your next question? That conversation was good, and she gave up a little bit of ground, but you only have 2 left. And so he's like, I think I've got a question. And Dulcinea says, you can't afford another impasse. If this doesn't shake something up, she's going to win the game. And so Palamedes kind of like shakes himself back to life after being distracted by the fact that he's smoking. And he says, right, next question, don't worry. I just wish I had more time to think. And the voice says, oh, you used to say that a lot. Again, giving us a little clue that this is someone that Palamedes has been in a relationship with in the past.
Right.
So, scene 5 happens. The stage is back. The coffins are back. The order has changed. Tamsyn so generously lists out the numbers to make us think that they matter. And Palamedes asks question number 4. And he says, back when we were at Canaan House, what did you make of Gideon Nav? This felt so random to me on my first read through. I think Ianthe also thinks this is very random. And Palamedes says, I have a question to spare, thought I'd use it on idle curiosity. Which is trash talking, which I think Ianthe actually sort of enjoys. But Palamedes makes it sound like this question doesn't really matter for his line of inquiry, but it definitely matters.
Right. So the attendants have set up the coffins in a ring, and Ianthe picks up a rapier, and throughout the rest of the scene, she sort of lazily faces up against the attendants. And I don't know if this was like a way to psych out Palamedes, who knows that his cavalier was just stabbed. But regardless, that's what she's doing this whole scene. And she starts to talk about Gideon Nav and says that she seemed totally off from the beginning. I loved the line where she says she wandered around like she was the protagonist and we were all there to give her something to look at. It's like the most meta line I feel like I read in these books. But generally talking at length about Gideon's swordplay, like she didn't know the rules of dueling. She swung her rapier around like a racket. Basically dismisses Gideon and says that she lived like a dope and died like a dope.
Yeah, that makes me so mad.
I know.
But it's interesting, too, because Palamedes asks, when did she realize that she underestimated Gideon? Ianthe said, underestimated her. I estimated Gideon Nav exactly right from the beginning. And it's funny because while a lot of this very clearly is Nibirius Turn's influence, I don't think Ianthe didn't also underestimate Gideon Nav.
Right. Well, I think it's interesting here because Nibirius is obviously coming through as we, as Palamedes points out later, but also Ianthe is lying. I mean, Palamedes also said this earlier that there's no reason, there's no vouchsafe on Ianthe telling the truth. So Ianthe's kind of lying now. Like, obviously, she's had a lot more interaction with Gideon at this point, and she knows that she underestimated her. And I just think that it's interesting that the lie that I think that Palamedes can see through tells as much about Ianthe as the truth,
Yeah, Totally.
And then we get to a very juicy Dulcinea section.
Oh my God, it's so juicy. It's so juicy.
Yeah. So after Ianthe answers the Gideon question, Palamedes thanks her and says the answer was very helpful. And Ianthe kind of looks at him suspiciously, but then the curtain is already closing. And he starts talking to this voice again. And the voice is asking Pal if he thinks that he can get Ianthe on this final question. And he says he thinks so. But he's also talking about how he feels really bad about trying to take over Turn's body. Like he was a shitty person, but he didn't deserve this. And then there's this really interesting bit that I don't really know what to think about. Dulcinea, mysterious voice, says, in response to Palamedes saying that Nibirius didn't deserve what he got, Dulcinea says, use every man after his desert and who should escape whipping. And Palamedes replies, I like that. Is it from something? And Dulcinea says, yes, it's complicated. So the first line, the use every man after his desert, is a line from Hamlet. And it's basically saying to treat people better than they deserve, because if everyone treated everyone how they deserved, then who could escape a whipping? Basically, people are shitty. But what I find interesting about this is not the use of a Shakespearean quote, which is pretty on par for Tamsyn Muir, but the fact that Dulcinea replies, yes, it's complicated to Palamedes' question. Is she saying that Shakespeare is complicated, which it can be, at least for me? Or is she saying that the way that she found this quote is complicated? Is something about the way she crossed the river, given her access to past history? Is it just that the quote itself is complicated? I mean, I don't know. What do you think?
Oh my God. I don't know either. First of all, I missed this reference, as of course I would, because it's a Shakespeare reference. And did I mention that I had trouble with plays in high school? Yeah. I mean, there are so many questions about where Dulcinea heard this quote. One thought that I did have, I have nothing to back this up on, is that seemingly Blood of Eden has some level of access to literature and art from Earth because their naming conventions are based off of trying to preserve that culture and art. And so it's possible that somehow Dulcinea has interacted with Blood of Eden in some weird way. And maybe that's where she gathered her Shakespearean knowledge. Mm-hmm. And I also think it's probably more likely that it has something to do with her being on the other shore of the river. But I don't know what that really means, and I cannot wait to find out.
Yeah, it's interesting that in this exact moment, I mean, we get quotes from the Bible, quotes from Shakespeare, quotes from pop culture, quotes from everything throughout these books, and they don't really seem to have like a purpose outside of being really cool, or like they don't really seem to have any like world building purpose most of the time. But this one seems to have some world building purpose. Mm-hmm. Or maybe I'm missing out on like every time that, you know, Gideon is quoting the Bible at Harrow. Like I just thought it was really cool, but maybe it is actually really significant to the world.
I saw this wild theory about exactly what you're saying, but I don't want to talk about it yet because we need to like finish the short story to share it, to have it make more sense.
Yeah.
But it's directly related to the memes and the cultural references made throughout these books actually being part of the narrative rather than just like a little poking fun and giving us little Easter eggs for funsies.
Interesting.
But to get into some like really juicy questions about how is it possible that the voice is Dulcinea? How is it possible that the two of them are able to communicate right now? Mm-hmm. They have this interaction where Palamedes asks Dulcinea, do you really still think of me as a child? And they kind of go through this back and forth where he says he wishes he could have saved her. And she said, oh, it's fine. At least we both got killed by the same person, meaning Kilrea. And Palamedes says, I want to believe you are who I think you are. You shouldn't be here. There's no way for you to have traveled here, even via the river. That's why I can't trust this, or you. How are you here? And Dulcinea says, I gambled on the truth. Palamedes says, good, then what? Dulcinea says, I died. You died? Again? Truly wonderful news for my haters. Will I ever know what happened? Dulcinea says, yes, but I'm really not allowed to tell you. It was something awful in the old sense of the word. I know this means you can't trust me, and that's fine. You got burned very badly. What? What does any of this mean? It's so fascinating to me, and it's so opaque. I have a theory. I just don't know if it makes any sense. But what's so weird is Dulcinea saying she died twice, and that she's not allowed to tell Palamedes what happened. What's going on there?
Well, do you want to say your theory?
I want to know if you have one.
Well, I don't really have like a complicated theory, except that I feel like, you know, in Abigail, in the final bits of the Alt Canaan House narrative of Harold the Ninth, where Abigail is talking to Ortis and she's saying, oh, we could really use your help crossing the river. I do believe the river can be crossed. And that seems to be kind of a radical way of thinking. Like even Magnus, I feel like, is trying to shush her up. So she leaves with Magnus and the children and Dulcinea to cross the river and to get to the other bank. And I think that there's something in like the theology of this world where obviously there's the river and there's the bank and ghosts are in the river and they're souls that haven't crossed, but that there is a way to cross the river. And then once you've crossed the river, something awful happens, awe being awesome, you know?
Mm.
And then your form or your substance or your spiritual state somehow changes. Like it's another afterlife, basically. But very few people, for whatever reason, are able to actually cross the river. But Abigail and Dulcinea and Magnus and the fourth twins were. And I think that's what happened. But I mean, I don't know for sure, but I'm 99% sure it is related to Abigail saying that they're going to try and cross the river and get to the other side.
I like that theory. I was more thinking that's interesting because the way that I read this, I read Dulcinea's two deaths as happening both at Canaan House. Or, you know, in the shuttle and then at Canaan House. I didn't read it as the death after crossing the river, like, you know, this sort of rebirth. Although I like that theory. What I had thought was that when she was killed by Cytherea initially, that she her soul somehow latched on to Cytherea's body. And then when Pal killed Cytherea, she somehow latched on to Pal's soul or body, or in some way. And the reason that I think this is because of the romance novel thread that was happening throughout Gideon the Ninth with Cytherea. I don't know. This is a very thin thread to go on. It's just that in thinking about how she is able to actually talk to Palamedes right now, to me, there has to be some connection between her soul and where Palamedes is, or this like bubble space. Unless anyone who's on the shores of the river on either side can just like pop in and out of the different bubbles that are being created, which maybe is possible. But to me, I feel like there's got to be some connection between Dulcinea and Palamedes that allows for this communication to happen. But I don't know.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I feel like I don't want to think it's any more jumping into people's bodies because I'm like categorically opposed to any more soul jumping. But that totally could be it. We certainly had a lot of it in both Harold the Ninth and Nona the Ninth.
Yeah.
But I feel like what I get stuck on is I gambled on the truth. And I think the truth is the thing that Abigail believed that no one else believes and is almost heretical.
I see. Yeah.
To their sort of Jod religion. So
yeah.
I don't know.
I like it. I might switch my theory to your theory. That's cool. I'm switching.
I do think that the river is like sort of purgatory if we're talking about connections to our own mythology. and that maybe you die, you go to purgatory, and then there's sort of like a second death where you either go through the stoma or to the other bank, one of which is heaven and one of which is hell. But I don't know.
Yeah.
I feel like we could talk about these like 7 lines for like an hour and a half.
Oh my God, totally. I'm like very hung up on them. I mean, and then there's a few more lines that add to this.
Mm-hmm.
They have this very touching back and forth between the two of them where Dulcinea shares a story from their letters to convince Palamedes that she is who she says she is. Pal then tells her that he loves her, and Dulcinea talks about how it would have been beautiful and Camilla would have had to cook, which I just think is so cute. I love this polycule picture that could have been for the three of them. And Dulcinea says, "You two are my best friends. That was real. I loved real, ugly, unfinished things. Gracelessly uncompleted things. There's freedom to and not ever being completed," which I just find very poetic and beautiful.
Yeah.
And she says, "And now I'm not in the river and I won't ever be again."
Yeah.
Palamedes says, "If you're on the shore, then I'll find you." Dulcinea says, "Which shore?" "It's a river. There are 2 shores. If this ends well, you'll find that out," which I think is evidence towards your theory in that Dulcinea has crossed the river and is on the other shore, which is why she wouldn't be in the river again. I can't imagine you can come back.
Right.
And yet she's here. So I don't know.
Yeah. I think this is such an interesting section. I also think there's this really interesting quote here where, well, if we can jump to this, Palamedes very sweetly asks if he can see Dulcinea for the first time. And Dulcinea surprisingly agrees. And in sort of the play speak, the lights go up in the house, so the audience is lit up. And Palamedes can see Dulcinea for the first time. And in response to this, he says this quote. Let's see if I can do the actual.
He says, "And her body was like the chrysolite, and her face as the appearance of lightning, and her eyes as a burning lamp, and her arms and all downward, even to the feet like in appearance to glittering brass."
Right. And that is a Bible verse. It is Daniel 10:6 in the Old Testament. And it refers to, I believe, although I actually didn't really look into this, it refers to an angel. And that made me think also back to my theory that this may not actually be Dulcinea's human pre-death form, but is rather like an angelic representation of her. Otherwise, this is a very dramatic way to describe just kind of a normal chick.
Well, I love that Palamedes says this very beautiful poetic thing that apparently is from the Bible. And then Dulcinea is like, "Was I cute?" And Palamedes says, "You're perfect," which is very cute. There is in what I was talking about earlier where she shares an example from letters that they had sent back and forth to each other to convince him that she was who she said she was. The anecdote that she shares is that Palamedes had asked her to share a description of her for him. And she did share a description, but it wasn't anything like what she looked like. And then Camilla drew that picture and they sent it to her. And that Dulcinea said that in her will, she put down that she wanted to look like that after she died. And so also part of me wonders if she took that form here, if that form is what she is showing Palamedes, which would also be very cool. Yeah,
I would not be surprised. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, full circle.
So, this scene is so juicy and oh my God, so many theories and unanswered questions. Really good.
Yeah, it's good. And it's really the first time that we get to see Palamedes and Dulcinea interact, right? In real life. I mean, it's not real life. It's so many layers removed from real life, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, totally. Where they actually have dialogue between each other that's not written down in letters.
Right.
All right, so scene 6. The curtain rises.
So the coffin order is changed again, and Palamedes asks his 5th and final question, although then it ends up not being his final question, but we'll get to that. He says, let's say Nibirius had died by misadventure before you were able to master the eightfold word. If he had died prematurely and left you without a cavalier, would you have used your sister instead?
Yes, and the attendants strike their coffin lids simultaneously once.
Yeah.
Which is similar to what had happened before. And again, based on Nibirius's feelings towards Coronabeth, could also be, again, Nibirius shining through here.
Right.
So the attendants rearrange the coffins so that Palamedes and Ianthe are each sitting on like a bench coffin with a coffin table between them. And they start to play cards, which, again, I don't know if this has any real significance. And there's no specific game that they seem to be playing.
Right. I feel like sometimes these things that are in this play, in a similar way that you would have in an actual play, just Ianthe and Palamedes talking would not be very visually interesting. So they are doing things while they're talking to make it more visually interesting. So it could just be that, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Let's go with it.
Okay.
So Ianthe answers that she would not, in fact, have used her sister in the event that Nibirius was unavailable. And she says that it's because Corona isn't a good enough swordswoman. And that while the purpose of a cavalier, sure, is to become the power source, it is also to become the defensive system for the lictor when their consciousness is temporarily elsewhere, right? Which we have seen over and over again in these books.
Right.
And this is interesting because, as Palamedes says later, it doesn't like really add up to him. However, you could buy this argument because Ianthe seems to believe that once a cavalier's soul is absorbed by the necromancer, that their sword skill level is frozen in time.
Right.
Meaning that they can't improve once they are absorbed. And so it's like any kind of skills or characteristics that the soul has developed in their life, that's it once they are absorbed into the necromancer. There is no improvement by any means because they are killed, according to Ianthe. And again, it brings us full circle back to the original question about soul permeability and the fundamental difference between what Ianthe thinks to be true and what Palamedes mostly knows to be true.
Right. And I feel like this was interesting to me because it seems to be the going theory. Like Ianthe's theory is not revolutionary. It's what most people seem to believe. But if that's so, I'm so confused why before the big fight with the resurrection beast in Harold the Ninth, why everyone was practicing their sword play so frantically, as if they could influence their sword play when they were out cold. You know what I mean? Seems like kind of a weird move.
Yeah.
If the theory was that it won't affect anything. And also, like, why was Augustine practicing with Ianthe so hard if he thought that it would just work once she passed out?
I think that it's not that because you're going off the theory that the soul is the battery's power and that they are bringing their sword skills from their life, but that part of the soul can't improve its sword skills, but that there is still Ianthe's soul and body's sword skills. I don't know. It's still Ianthe's body that has to be strong and have like some sort of muscle memory, right? So you're right. It does seem like it goes against that theory. And I guess you could argue that the body holds memory and skill as well. And so it could be that Ianthe was trying to improve her sword skills that are then complemented by Nibirius's. But I don't know. It also confused me.
Who knows?
So Ianthe and Palamedes continue to go back and forth, and Palamedes really pokes and prods her on the subject, really trying to understand why she wouldn't use her sister, since Ianthe has already claimed, like we mentioned, that the goal is always worth the cost.
Right.
But she doesn't budge. She says she would not eat her sister, and Palamedes then calls her out and pretty much says what many of us, I think, who know and love these books and have read these books a million times have concluded ourselves, which is that Palamedes says there's two possibilities for why you wouldn't use your sister here. One is that what you said before was bravado, that there are costs that even Ianthe won't pay in pursuit of her goal. Or, more likely, that Coronabeth herself is part of your goal. You can't spend her because you'd invalidate the very thing you were trying to buy. Are you going to tell me which it is, or do you want me to guess?
And this all comes back to Ianthe's grand plan, TM, which I think we've talked about a lot, which is maybe something about her and Coronabeth ruling the universe. I always come back to like beginning of Harrow the Ninth when Ianthe goes to see God about a queen. You know, little moments like that where I'm like, I think her plan is to have Corona be the sexy face of her cruel, cruel empire.
Yeah, totally. And Ianthe is like so frustrated and angry by this line of questioning. And she's just like, you know what? No, I would not have killed Corona, and I don't have to justify this to you. It's time for you to just pick your coffin because I'm tired of this. And Palamedes somehow convinces her to answer one final yes or no question.
Right. Maybe this is to make up for the fact that she kind of took his first question.
Yeah.
And his final question, and the question that wins the game, is Palamedes asks, do you know where Nibirius Turn's body is? And Coronabeth doesn't answer, and they kind of move to either side of the coffins, and they start to open them one by one. And Palamedes starts to go through his point by point how he came to the conclusion that Ianthe also doesn't know what coffin Nibirius is in.
Right. And this part of the story is, it's like when I was first reading it and I'm like, man, this feels like a test. And then I get to the end and I'm like, oh, all the answers are in the back of the textbook.
Right.
This is the exposition that where Tamsyn just like really lays it out for us is very helpful and very logical and very clear. So the evidence that he talks through, where he's basically saying Nibirius is actually part of Ianthe. He's not a separate entity. There's essentially like 4 main points that he makes. One is that he was wearing a gray suit with a purple tie, which I think is related to Nibirius's like purple neckerchief or something that he used to wear around town. The cigarettes, which we already talked about, where Pal's never smoked, but Nibirius has, and so he was just like able to do this. And so what we're seeing here is that even Palamedes is being influenced by Nibirius's soul for those first 2 examples. And then the second 2 examples are around Gideon Nav, where Ianthe claims she was using her rapier like a racket and claims to have witnessed her using her rapier. But Palamedes epically schools her in this, even though she tries very hard to say that she was there. She was not, but Nibirius was. And finally, that she was really hung up on the fact that Gideon Nab didn't understand dueling and really hung up on the rules of dueling. But that this is very clearly Nibirius and not Ianthe, because we all know that Ianthe does not give 2 shits about rules, as she says in the beginning of this play. And so this is her bubble, but her bubble has many traces of Nibirius, that it's undeniable that Nibirius' soul has been grafted onto Ianthe's. And just like that, that's his gotcha moment.
Yeah, and he kind of leaves her just looking at the final coffin. They don't open the final coffin, but she's realizing that she has kind of defeated herself, right? She's said that she doesn't believe in the permeability of the soul, but she obviously, she knows that if she opens that coffin, Nibirius won't be there. And that proves herself wrong. And I think that's just where the curtain falls, right?
Yeah. One of the many metaphors, Palamedes metaphors here. And I like that the story ends with this metaphor, because we actually started with the funeral procession with the piles of meat. And we end with Palamedes saying, you swallowed a piece of meat. And the longer you digest that meat, the more its proteins and lipids and molecules mix in with yours until you can't tell them apart anymore. I love that how complicated Tamsyn Muir has made her world that like she can only describe it through so many different metaphors.
Yeah.
And it's very helpful.
Yeah.
And definitely helps me understand. I think that one of the big lingering questions for me is the same question that Sarah Haskin has, who wrote into us a long time ago when we said we were working on this episode. And the question that Sarah asks is, what did you make of how the story ended? How exactly did Pal best Ianthe? Just by proving that her belief about the impermeability of souls was incorrect? Was he saying that based on his own logic and given the examples of his purple tie, his trash talk, and his cigarette smoking, that he had already absorbed some of Ianthe's soul personality, and therefore, since she absorbed Babs's soul by the transitive property, he had also absorbed some of Babs's soul and so had access to Babs's body? Am I way overthinking this? What do you think, Amy?
So I think it's actually, I mean, I don't think that Sarah's overthinking this. I think we all thought this exact same way. But I think if you really boil it down, the game was, tell me which of these coffins Nibiria's turn is in. And Palamedes answers, he's in none of them. And he wins the game. That's how he won the game. He answered it correctly. And the original terms were, if he answered correctly, then, he won. So I think that's how he won the game. But he won the game also by outmaneuvering Ianthe into realizing that her theory about the permeability of the soul is incorrect. So I think he also, because I'm also just kind of like, would Ianthe have really like given, even if he had won, would she have given over? And I think the way he really wins is that she is so taken aback by the realization that she is so deeply wrong about her beliefs about herself and what she's done and who she is, have given him the sort of friction he needs to grab onto Nibirius and take hold. Mm-hmm. So I think that's what happened. And I think it's interesting because we think this whole time that the unwanted guest is Palamedes, or at least I did that at the beginning. That makes sense. Mm-hmm. But then you realize at the end that the unwanted guest, like who Ianthe really doesn't want in there, is Nibirius. Mm-hmm. And in that realization, she loosens her hold on the body enough that Pal is able to get in. But also, yeah, again, he just won the game. Like pure and plain and simple. He gave her an answer and it was correct.
Right. Ianthe's not one to honor the game. So I prefer the other part of what you were saying around she released enough of her hold on Nibirius that Palamedes was able to actually grab onto him. Mm-hmm. Because Ianthe has no incentive to uphold her end of the bargain ever, Mm-hmm. And so I don't know if it's as simple as he won the game and therefore gets the body. Mm-hmm. But I really liked what you were saying about her just being so horrified by the fact that she is not herself anymore and that Nibirius is now part of her, that she's like, fuck. Mm-hmm.
Right, because she obviously, to some degree, totally disdained him, right?
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Sarah, for writing in. We'll move into our next audience question, which is from Sally Martinez. And this person had the most interesting insight into the implications of the unwanted guest. And mostly their interest was in what the implications were for the permeability of the soul. And I'm just going to read what this message says. At what point is Mercy's love for John genuine? And at what point is that Christabel's influence in her soul to love and worship God the way a follower does? And was it always and grew more intense, or was there a shift in her? Also, the hateful, caring relationship between Mercy and Augustine is at once them both butting heads like they always have, and also their Cavalier's deep love for each other seeping into each other's souls and making everything more complicated. Yeah. I feel like I thought about this exact permeability thing in other contexts, but this message, I never thought about Mercy Morn in this context. But it makes so much sense.
It makes so much sense. And if you think about how quickly Pal was influenced by Nibirius' soul, just for the short amount of time that he was in that bubble. Like, can you imagine the implications of that on a lictor who has been around for 10,000 years? I mean, it makes total sense that the characters that we now know as Mercy Morn and Augustine and Gideon the First, although we'll put Gideon the First aside and Pyrrha because they're actually a special case. But for Mercy and Augustine's characters, I mean, who are they really? I think they are more like Paul than any other, character in the series. They are essentially 10,000 years of like absorption happening. And so to me at this point, and I'm gonna have to go reread Harrow with this lens now and just pick it apart all over again. And hey, we'll start a second podcast that's like rereading of Harrow the Ninth with a focus on soul permeability. I just think it does make the characters way more interesting. They were already interesting. Now they're even more interesting. And I think it totally provides a level of depth, in particular in the relationship between Mercy and Augustine, and how it's actually not just between the two of them. It's between 4 souls that are kind of intermingled.
Yeah, and it's also, the implications also make it like there could be that Mercy Morn is more affected by Christabel than Augustine is by Alfred. We don't know if it's the exact same for everyone. And I'm also wondering if Mercy Morn and Augustine lived for 200,000 years, would they become a gestalt, kind of like Paul?
Right.
Would they become one? And would that be like catharsis, or would it be like that? Like, is there something different about where they're going than where Paul ends up in like just a quick period of time? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it makes sense. And I don't think that we really know. And if we layer on the theory around the battery running out over time, then at what point does the battery stop working because the soul has actually been fully absorbed and they are more like a Paul? Like, what is the threshold of influence that these souls have on each other? And then when does the battery source run out? I don't know.
I think we'll be able to get a little bit more of an answer for this when we see how powerful Paul is. Yeah. Right? Like, is Paul Lictor powerful, or is Paul just a normal necromancer?
Right.
Because Paul is not burning anything or anyone.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Right. Like, there is no using, in Paul's case, nobody is using one soul to power another.
Right. Or at least we don't think so.
Yeah, we don't think so. Or there isn't one primary soul and then one secondary soul. Like, they are one person. It's so crazy.
Yeah. And then we have quote unquote perfect lictorhood, like what Alecto and John have, which are them using each other's souls, but also no one's dead. So we've kind of got a couple of different like sub lictor types.
Right. And similarly, you have Pyrrha and Gideon the First, and
I know, what the hell?
And like how they did it, and how Pyrrha
what happened
was
there?
Kind of dormant. I mean, it's so confusing, and I suppose we could create an episode that goes through all of the nuances of how each of these lictors or lictor-like characters got to where they are, like how they did the eightfold word or whatever. Because it's nuanced enough that the impact on the souls is different.
I would love to ask Tamsyn Muir, when she wrote these books, did she write down, in her notes, like, these are the rules for lictors, and like, these are the different ways you can be a lictor? Or was it just following the story?
Yeah.
And like these different things, I just like, how deep does this go?
I know. At what point, I think for me, at what point did she come up with the soul permeability rule in this universe? Because if she came up with it from the beginning, then like we really have to go back and reread everything.
I know.
I mean, and even if she didn't, it's still worth going back and reading it with that lens. But yeah, I mean, there's so many implications for this. And I really appreciate this flag about Mercy Morn and and Christabel. And in particular, I think the same person wrote in that they can't imagine being an atheist in a previous life and feeling no devotion to God, only to have your soul merged with a nun who has done nothing but devote her life to God, which is such a great point. And it's just totally wild. Like, there's still coming back to that question that I think continues to come up in these books around, like, what makes you who you are?
Mm-hmm.
And at what point doesn't it matter? Like, maybe it doesn't even matter at this point, 10,000 years later, what parts of Mercy are Mercy and what parts of Mercy are Christabel, because she just is this version.
Both of them. Yeah.
You know?
Oh, wow. Yeah. I mean...
And Amy, there's another big thing I just want to mention here in terms of the implications of soul permeability. And this is...
Can I just really quick cut in and say that Mel left me the cutest voice memo on a run yesterday explaining this theory. And I laughed and laughed and laughed. Sorry, go ahead.
I was like, I don't want to forget this. So here's a voice memo. I was thinking about how I have been really hung up on, probably not rightfully so, how broad, like how wide a net Nona casts in terms of who she's attracted to, and how sometimes it doesn't make sense to me who she's not attracted to. So like in terms of the list of people that Nona is attracted to, she's attracted to Cam, Coronabeth, and Pash. She's not attracted to Gideon, which is weird. But I was thinking about the idea of soul permeability here, and like, what parts of Nona are attracted to these people? Theoretically, there's a little bit of Gideon, a little bit of Harrow, and Nona in this body. And so between the three of them, now to me it makes sense that I don't think Gideon would be attracted to herself. And I don't think Gideon would be attracted to Pash. This could be wrong of me, but I just don't, because Gideon is attracted to Harrow.
Right.
But Gideon is attracted to Coronabeth pretty intensely. So that would explain Nona's attraction to Coronabeth, and why I was so confused about how when Nona was in her Barbie body, when Electo is in her Barbie body and she was like, I am hideousness or something. Like, it doesn't track to me that she would think her own Electo body was hideous, but that Coronabeth was the hottest person ever. So
you're viewing Coronabeth as like a Barbie figure.
Exactly.
Sort of.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like a ripped version. But like, that has to be Gideon's soul kind of seeping in here, in my opinion.
I know. I think you're so right. And I think about it especially with Gideon, because again, we have that incredible Tamsyn Muir quote where she said that Harrow ate a Happy Meal that was Gideon, but she like ate the burger and left the fries.
Right.
I always forget the exact wording. And are the fries still in Harrow's body at this point? Or is what part of the Happy Meal is still in Harrow's body?
Right. Well, the part that is attracted to Coronabeth, I think.
100p.
And I think that Harrow and maybe Electo would be attracted to Pash. So I don't know who that is. But I don't think Harrow is attracted to Cam. But I could be wrong.
Yeah, who knows? Who knows? But it is very interesting. We're going to have to keep on thinking about this. Even in Electo, I don't think we'll know exactly what percentage. It won't be like Tamsyn Muir will be like, and Paul said that there was still 5% of Gideon left in Harrow's body, you know?
But it's almost like, does it matter how much, right? Because if any part of the soul is, anyway, yeah, who knows? The point, though, is that we assume that there is a little bit of Gideon, Harrow, and Electo souls in this body. So therefore, this wide spectrum of attraction makes a lot more sense to me now. End of my thesis.
Wow. Yeah, I'd love to think about it. I'm not going to be able to sleep tonight. If we're good with audience questions, I think we can really quickly wrap up what we learn in The Unwanted Guest. We learn that when Camilla grabs onto Ianthe and Palamedes have a long, drawn-out battle of the wits inside Ianthe's mind, in which Ianthe challenges Palamedes to a game, and Palamedes, with the help randomly of Dulcinea, the OG Dulcinea, Palamedes solves this riddle or this game, And Ianthe is left realizing that the true unwanted guest in her head is not Palamedes, but is rather Nibiria's turn. Is that right?
That's right.
With obviously huge, like, book-spanning implications.
Yes. But really, as usual, jam-packed short story offering by Tamsyn Muir to the fans. And we couldn't have asked for anything better than this.
Yeah, I really thought that this was such a joy to read. I think the first time I read it, I got caught up on the structure, it being a play, and all the little nuances that made it kind of difficult to understand. But now that I've read it a couple of times, I think it's pretty clear. It doesn't actually give us that much information outside of massive implications for the permeability of the soul.
Right.
And we'll jump back in next episode with chapter, I think, 24, in which this has already happened. In the space between chapter 23 and 24, this short story happens. So we're going to jump right back in very chronologically with chapter 24.
Swell. Well, thanks, y'all, for hanging in here for this long and fun, I think, episode.
And if you guys have any questions or comments or want to point out something that we missed, as always, message us on our website, lockedtoompod.com, or on Twitter at lockedtoompod. And if you like this podcast, please tell your friends to listen and rate and review us wherever you're listening to this. Thanks, Olivia K, for our theme music. I'm Amy.
And I'm Mel.
And we'll see you next time here at the Locked Toon Podcast.